Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be doing the mid-year freakout tag. I'll be putting the original video as well as all of the questions in the comments, alongside some of the places that I've shared in previous videos that you can go to donate, and as well as petitions that you can sign for the Black Lives Matter movement and for the betterment of Black trans people. The first question in this tag is the best book of 2020 so far. For that, I'm going to be talking about two different books. I do think that one is maybe slightly edged the other out, but I still really love both of them, so I'm going to talk about both of them. The one that I read earlier in the year was In the Dreamhouse by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a memoir told in mostly second person that talks about the author's experience being in an abusive queer relationship. All of this is situated within a few first-person chapters where she talks in detail about other barriers like the judicial system, as well as media representation that queer women face when trying to get justice for domestic violence situations. This was absolutely fantastic. The writing style to the actual content, which is very important and is often neglected. Now, the book that I read more recently that I do think I would put as my top of 2020 so far is When They Call You a Terrorist by Patrisse Khancullers and Asha Bandele. This is the memoir of Patrisse Khancullers, who is one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. She talks about her experience growing up in a California city during the war on drugs. This is such an important book. This is an era that I was not really taught about that much in school up until I got into grad school, actually, the first time that we really talked about a whole lot of politics. Like, I know that we, mentioned Ronald Reagan and, kind of touched on some stuff in my undergrad, but the only time we really delved into, the 80s and 90s at all was in the class on race in the United States. So this gives a lot of perspective, especially with all of the things going on right now. This is an absolutely essential read. This tells you about the beginning of what we have now, that organization, Black Lives Matter. Another great thing about this is that she acknowledges the queer people's roles within all of this organizing. She herself is queer, but she also acknowledges the fact that so many trans women have also played integral roles, as well as other trans and queer people. So much of this book was amazing. The writing style was awesome. I expected to be blown away by the foreword because it was by Angela Davis, right? But the whole book, there were places where I just got chills. The next question is, name the best sequel of 2020. I have not read a ton of sequels. I think the only sequels that I've read have been graphic novels. So I'm basically just going to be talking about my favorite graphic novel, or one of them anyways. And that's going to be Heartstopper. I read the first one, and then I read the rest of them online, so I'm not really sure if I liked volume 2 or 3 better because I just read all of them. To me, the story is just getting better and better as kind of more things are happening and more things are added. I adore this. I was actually really just blown away by it. I had been reading a lot of gay graphic novels that were cute and fluffy, but this one went further than any of the other ones had so far as making me just fall in love with the couple. I felt like I was reading fan fiction of my OTP. So this is definitely going to be my favorite sequel. The next question is, what is a new release that you have not read yet but want to? And for that, I'm going to say The Henna Wars. I just recently got this and I am super excited to read it. It is a sapphic romance-ish young adult book. There's a whole plot line in it about where they're competing. Apparently there's also some discussion about cultural appropriation and different things like that. But I'm actually planning on reading this next month. The Fuckathon has a prompt, Fuck Theological Fundamentalism, where you have to read a book that has a character that's a different religion than you, and that's going to be my pick for that. The next question is an anticipated release for the second half of the year. And I really need to look and see what other new releases there are. I haven't really looked much beyond what's been hyped. However, Cemetery Boys, I have heard nothing but great things about. It's a story about a young Bruja trans boy who is trying to do his rites of passage, but is told that he can't because he's trans. But he tries to do it anyways and ends up summoning the ghost of one of his former classmates. It sounds really good, and I've heard that it's really cute. It's a queer Latinx middle grade, so it sounds like it's gonna be a good time. I'll leave a link in the description to Audrey from Perpetual Pages, who has talked a ton about this book. The next prompt is your biggest disappointment, and I think that's gonna have to go to Kings, Queens, and In-Betweens. This was an audiobook that I listened to, I wanna say either in February or April, and I had really high hopes for it. It talks about drag. I love LGBT, YA fiction, but it just really missed the mark. I thought that the writing was okay, but there were some really big things that just made it a no-go for me. I found the way that they treated the main trans best friend kind of off-putting. I think that in parts of it, they kind of conflated drag and being trans, and as somebody who is knowledgeable about those topics, like, I understood what they were talking about, but I think that that book going to somebody who's not knowledgeable could lead them to believe some pretty incorrect things. On top of all that, there is also the issue of a minor going into adult spaces and interacting with adults, even like kissing adults without talking about their age first. And that just really grossed me out. So that was a no for me. The next prompt is the biggest surprise. And I have 3 that I was very surprised to like in ways that I wasn't expecting. The first one of those is On A Sunbeam by Tilly Walden. This book. This is one of the first larger graphic novels that I've read. I hadn't really seen much beyond, I kind of started reading manga towards the end of last year. But this was the first kind of like big one-off that I'd read. I also hadn't read a whole lot of fantasy recently, and I certainly hadn't read any fantasy graphic novels, unless you count like Bleach and Claymore, because that could fit into fantasy, but this is more like heavy sci-fi. Reading this book felt like I was being introduced to a whole new medium. I was absolutely blown away. The artwork is just so stunning. There we go. This is my fave. That's Elliot, the non-binary side character. This book is incredibly gay. Like, there's more artwork. I think every single character in this is gay. There are no men to be seen. Praise. It was just a really wonderful experience altogether. Every one of the characters I fell in love with. The plot was really interesting, the way that they used time. All of the sci-fi elements are so cool. This was a surprise because it just went beyond any expectations that I could have foreseen having at all. Another book that surprised me was The Care and Feeding of Ravenously Hungry Girls by Anissa Gray. I listened to this audiobook because it was one of the few that was available at my library, and I recognized the cover as one that I'd seen at work and thought was really beautiful. It was an adult fiction. It dealt with somebody going through a lawsuit and being in jail, so I was like, oh, I had pretty low expectations. I was just trying to listen to something to drive to. But it was really good. It went back and forth between 3 different sisters' perspectives. One of the sisters was in jail for fraud. One of the sisters was kind of taking care of their family house. And then the third one was going back and forth about coming into town. She had moved away. One of the sisters is a lesbian. They also deal with eating disorders within this, and they also talk about trauma, family trauma, and there's also a trigger warning for suicide in here as well. But it was just really a good book. The third book that I read that surprised me was Upright Woman Wanted by Sarah Gailey. Now, I did think that this book would at least be neat, if nothing else. Queer anti-fascist librarians is basically the synopsis that I had, and the synopsis that I would still give for it, honestly. But this is a Western, and before I'd heard of Sarah Gailey, I probably would assume that I would just never read a Western novel. But this blew me away. I freaking loved it. I want to read everything that Sarah Gailey's ever written. I want an entire series with the characters from Run Point Women Wanted. There was a non-binary love interest. There was just a casual, sapphic, polyamorous triad thrown in there. And there was actually a discussion of compersion when the main character was talking about her ex-girlfriend. So there's a whole lot there on top of the story just being cool. The only thing that I didn't like was that it's so short because it's a novella. The next question on here is your favorite new or new to you author. I'm going to be going with a new to me author, and that is going to be Leslie Feinberg. This year I read Stone Butch Blues, and then recently I read Transliberation, and both of them were just really amazing. Stone Butch Blues is semi-autobiographical, and it follows this character who is gay during the 60s. It focuses on them being queer while they're young and then growing up, and the experience that they have in gay bars throughout the 60s and 70s. Definitely a hard trigger warning for sexual assault, police brutality, and suicide. But it was just amazing. Like, if you want to read something to give you an idea of just how difficult it was to be out and queer, like visibly queer, gender non-conforming during that time, read that book. It's an absolutely heartbreaking read, but it is so beautiful, and some of the discussion that they had about language and the need for it, it was sad to see their struggle, but it was really validating to, I guess, what I'm trying to put out in society. Like, I study language. A lot of the stuff that I've done, like, as an activist has to do with putting information out, about language, and I really focus on how the language gives us agency, but also connection to other people. And that was kind of validation for that, on top of, like, kind of my own feelings with gender stuff. Honestly, I need to reread it and do a whole video on it. I just ordered my own copy, which is taking forever to come in. But whenever I do get it, I do intend on rereading it and doing a video on it. The other book of hers that I've read is Transliberation, and I talked about it at length in the last video that I did. And it's just really wonderful. One of the biggest things that I got out of it was the need for solidarity. But you can watch that video if you want more in depth, because I'll end up going on just a tangent. But I love Leslie Feinberg, and I love what Z stands for. The next question is, who is your newest fictional crush? And I've got to say that I haven't had a whole lot of fictional crushes. Like, if anything, I think I end up feeling more towards certain people's relationships than the actual person. Like, not like I want to be in the relationship, but I want that relationship to happen. So because of that, I'll be talking about my favorite OTP instead of fictional crush. And that is going to be Nova and Tom from Mooncakes. This book is literally the cutest. Queer, witchy. I think this is what people mean when they say cottagecore, except it's more warm and autumnal. And the characters are just so precious. I would die for Tam, and I would die for Nova. I would also die for Nova's grandmas. Grandmas as in, she has grandmas who are married together. This book is just so good. It's a fantasy book. Tam is a werewolf, Nova is a witch. They have to basically catch some bad guys that are trying to do some stuff with werewolf magic that is evil. But it's just really pure. It's a wonderful read. Highly recommend if you can get your hands on it. You kind of have to get it secondhand because I don't think they've gone through a second printing. So yeah. The next question is your newest favorite character. And this is really hard because there are lots of really good characters. Talked about Mooncakes. I already talked about Heartstopper, and both of those characters have my whole heart. But I think the character that I'm going to focus on is Aster from The Witch Boy. The Witch Boy is a middle grade trilogy. I've actually done a whole review on it. It's basically a trans allegory. And Aster is this boy who grew up in a magical family, is supposed to be a shapeshifter since he's a boy, but he actually wants to be a witch. So the whole series focuses on him trying to get his family to basically accept him. There's also a lot of different adventures that I don't want to go into too deep because I don't want to spoil things, but the adventure, particularly in the first book, definitely goes along with the themes of kind of the trans allegory and the harm of transphobia. Aster is small and precious and deserves to be saved at all costs. While we're on the topic of the witch boy, we're going to talk about another one of my favorite characters, his best friend, Charlie, who is very outgoing and very loving towards Aster, but also towards some of the other characters in the book. And honestly, she also needs to be protected at all costs. So this is a really wholesome book series. Check out my review on it, and please read it. The next question is to name a book that made you cry. And I think, honestly, we'd be here less time if I talked about the books that didn't make me cry. Maybe it's because I'm a Pisces. Maybe it's because I'm depressed and more prone to emotional stuff. Who knows? I don't. But I have 3 in particular that made me cry in 3 different ways. I will start with The Deep and Dark Blue by Nikki Smith. This is a middle grade fantasy graphic novel. The main character is a trans girl. They don't really use that language, but it is set in a fantasy setting. Her and her twin brother end up basically having to go into hiding because of this plot line where, you know, they're nobility, but they get overtaken. So they have to hide basically in a monastery for nuns. I think that's the right word. She ends up really finding her place there, really fitting in her groove. She figures out that, like, this is her. And the reason that this book made me cry is because its trans representation was wholly reliant on where she found home. It wasn't about, like, there was a little bit of worry in how people would react. There's no transphobia. There is no focus on, I feel terrible like this. It is totally looking at what makes you feel at home. And that was just so incredibly beautiful. There aren't enough trans narratives that aren't situated in trauma. And part of that is because I think a lot of cis people don't really understand why you would go through a bunch of stuff if you weren't, like, in pain. So it's like, if you don't have a reason to do it, why would you do it? And then there's also a piece of that that's like, people like trauma porn. We won't get into that, but this was a cute book. Like, the plotline was cute. I think that it would have been nice for it to be longer, but I mean, for like a middle grade graphic novel, it was great. And the trans rep made me cry. The next book that I'm going to be talking about that made me cry is a young adult graphic novel, Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me. This focuses on the relationship between Freddie and Laura Dean. Our main character, Freddie, keeps going back together with Laura Dean despite the fact that she's really kind of a toxic person. She only goes with Freddie when she wants to. They kind of end up breaking up on a whim. She cheats on her a lot. But throughout this whole book, there are a few different points. There's looking at how your other friendships are impacted when you're in a toxic relationship. And there's also the piece that is saying that you should expect more for yourself. You shouldn't settle for somebody who's hurting you, even if it's not the worst relationship. Like, it wasn't really abusive, but you still deserve more than that. If it's not what you need, and if it makes you uncomfortable, you don't need to be in that. Even if you have some feelings for them, you deserve better. But this is something that I needed in high school. It's something that I needed as, like, a 20-year-old. It's something that I needed, like, 2 years ago. So it's really great that it's out there. And it made me cry. I'm tearing up thinking about it. The final book that I had that made me cry was Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Faid Menon. I also talk about this book in my latest video, and I have talked about Alok so many times. I adore them. I felt very seen in this book in a number of ways. I will absolutely go on a tangent if I start talking about it, so check out my other video if you want to know more, and definitely buy Alok's book. Also buy Alok's book Femme in Public because it's a fantastic book of poetry. This is also really good if anyone's interested in some like Trans 101 stuff. They share parts of their story, but they also debunk a lot of common misconceptions about trans and non-binary people. The next question is books that made you happy. I think a lot of the books that I've read this year made me happy. Gay graphic novels make me happy. Things like Beyond the Gender Binary and Trans Liberation make me happy. And another book that made me happy was How Poetry Can Change Your Heart by Andrea Gibson and Megan Falley. This book has some poetry in it, but it's actually mostly about poetry. It's pretty small, but it's very potent. This is good if you are starting out with poetry, if you already really love poetry, if you read it, or if you write it. This made me think of poetry in kind of a different way. I think a lot of it is stuff that I've kind of thought about before, but just haven't thought about in a while. Especially, you know, my undergrad was in English, but that's been 5 years. Oh, I'm old. I'm so old. It's been about 5 years, and this just really highlights the beauty that can be found in words. So I highly recommend this. I read this at the beginning of April, which was National Poetry Month, and I read this, and then I read Sappho. Man, if you want a super great gay time, read this, and then read Sappho, and then read some of Andrea Gibson's other poetry while you're at it. But this book definitely made me happy. The next question is the most beautiful book you've bought or received this year. And since we already know that I'm indecisive as hell, I'm gonna go with 2 books. So the first is The Deep and Dark Blue, which I've already talked about. The reason that I initially looked at this book at all was just because of the cover. I hadn't seen anyone talk about it, which is sort of surprising because it's got really great trans rep. It came out this year. This was the 2020 release. But I just thought like the colors are outstanding and the art is really cute. The other one is The Henna War, which it may be hard to tell kind of on camera, but looking really close at the art and the details, this cover is just really beautiful. The final question in the tag is, what books do you plan on reading before the end of the year? Asking what is actually on my TBR is always difficult. I make monthly TBRs, I get to like maybe half the books, but I'll talk about a few that in theory I want to get to before the end of the year. One of them is that I want to finish Moving Politics by Deborah Gould. This looks at the ACT UP organization during the AIDS epidemic. I have still not touched it since the last time I talked about it in a video, so I still have the last third to read. I really love the book. I just haven't picked it up. I don't have a reason. The next book that I want to read by the end of the year is Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. This is one that I started reading a while back. It's been over a year, I think. But I got through the first chapter, I want to say. It was really engaging, and looking at like the intersection of transness and blackness throughout history is so important, especially when we're talking about intersectionality and solidarity and how everything is connected. It is pretty dense, so like if you're thinking of reading it, if you're not used to academic writings, this might not be for you. But I'm super interested in it. This is another one where like, why did I stop reading it? Who knows? Not me. Another book, kind of going along the same vein, is Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory by Patricia Hill Collins. If you have not heard of Patricia Hill Collins before, she is a very important feminist writer. She authored Black Feminist Thought, which is just an incredible book. This book really expanded my understanding of feminism, and lots of other things, to be honest. I definitely highly recommend this book. I have not read Intersectionality yet, so I can't recommend it, clearly. But Black Feminist Thought is basically about changing your perspective of what's seen as valid information or a valid perspective, and brings in basically the canon of Black women. It's pretty accessible. There's a little bit of jargon towards the beginning because she talks about epistemology, but she really does write for the purpose of everybody being able to read her work. So I highly recommend getting a copy of this if you can. Definitely check your libraries. I know it can be a little bit pricey if you're buying it, but especially like if you're a student, you should probably have this in a college library. But that book was absolutely fantastic. I've read other excerpts from Patricia Hill Collins, so we're gonna read Intersectionality hopefully next month. I plan to at least start this for the Fuck White Supremacy prompt for the Fuckathon. And the final book that I want to get to sometime this year is the autobiography of Assata Shakur. This is one that I read in December and then, or started reading in December, and then I kind of stopped. I think I took a break because it is pretty intense. It talks at length about her experience with police brutality. For those who don't know, Assata Shakur was a member of the Black Panther Party, and she was accused of killing a police officer, despite evidence to the contrary, including like how her bones were broken because she was shot in the middle of that shootout. But it basically goes back and forth between her time after being captured and then going back in her childhood, so you get to kind of see her whole life, at least up until the publication of this book, 1987. I believe she's still, I want to say, in Cuba as a refugee, because she would be a political prisoner. So hopefully I'll get to those before the end of the year. I have other ones that I want to read too, but those are, I think, ones that I can solidly say that I'll at least read some of before the end of the year. If you've read any of the books that I've mentioned, definitely let me know what you thought about them down in the comments. If you want to do this tag, consider yourself tagged. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.